Hello everybody, this is Money Mom. Welcome back to the channel. I felt nostalgic and I wanted to do a video about comparing the 1970s to the 1980s from my perspective. Let's get started. I first had to tell you this. I do have one thing from the 1980s, this sweater from my lovely mom who passed away a few years ago, and I just had to wear it. I tried to get my hair looking 1980s. And I couldn't. I did put on a little more makeup, but I don't know how 80s I look right now. But I had to share that with you guys. Now, I want to talk about what I noticed in my own personal life of the changes from the 70s to the 80s. I grew up in the Twin Cities, a suburb of St. Paul, Woodbury, Minnesota. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. So this is from my own personal perspective. Everyone may live obviously in a different area, and you may have had a totally different experience. I was born in March of 1965, so I started kindergarten in 1970. And when I noticed things started really changing in my world was about 78, 79. I went to ninth grade, I think, in 1979. So I grew up in Woodbury, Minnesota. And I'll get to this part later, but in 1979 is when many of the neighbors started moving to bigger homes. And then for 4 years, we moved to Stillwater, Minnesota, which is close to the Twin Cities. My mom was not a big fan of that area, so we ended up moving back to Woodbury. But this is what I noticed from my own personal perspective about the 1970s and why I think I feel a lot of nostalgia and why I kind of miss the 1970s and consider it the good old days. So one of the big things I noticed is that back in the 1970s, especially early 1970s, many stay-at-home moms. And so a lot of the moms took care of most of the things around the home. You had an ironing day, home-cooked meals, and many times what would happen is moms would help other moms babysit their kids if they needed help. Just a lot of neighbors helping each other. That was big. Many of our neighbors just had one vehicle. There were some that were two-car families, but if the woman needed the car, what would happen a lot of times is she would drop her husband off at work. So that was one big thing that I noticed. We all had one phone. There was no such thing as call on the other line or caller ID. It was something simple. Someone was trying to call you, the phone would be busy. Basically, the homes in our neighborhood, now we did have basements back then. It was a small home called a Rambler, and they had one bathroom. You didn't have walk-in closets, so you just didn't buy a whole lot of stuff. We mostly played outdoors. We roller skated, played hopscotch, rode our bikes, so that was basically it. We paid cash for almost everything. My dad, I don't remember us ever having a car payment. We would save for things that we wanted. Now we did have a Sears credit card, and sometimes my dad might put like a new washer or dryer on that. That was something. We mostly ate at home unless it was something very special, but we mostly ate all home cooked meals, and we ate a lot of leftovers. And I mentioned about neighbors helping. One other thing is most people could live off one income, and you just, if you couldn't afford it, you didn't buy it. But it was just a really simple time, and we all worked together as a wonderful community. Now, this is in our particular neighborhood. One other thing I noticed is we didn't go shopping very often. I don't remember back in the early 70s, at least, to even say 76, 77, I don't remember there being malls. There may have been, but we only shopped when we needed something. And like for holidays like Christmas, you would get clothes. That would be one of the things you'd get, where for your birthday or Christmas, you would receive clothes. We didn't have very many clothes. We had nice clothes, and we kept them clean and we pressed them. And so we took really good care of everything we had, but we didn't have a lot of stuff. We didn't have very many pair of shoes. We have like a pair of dress shoes, a pair of play shoes, maybe a pair of school shoes. So that would just be an example. So this is kind of how I grew up. Everybody had their role, and that's what I grew up with. Oh, we did have a television, but we just shared one television. There were like 4 channels. We would watch variety shows. We didn't watch a lot of TV. We had to ask permission to watch it. And so we would watch TV as a family, and basically we spent a lot of our time outdoors. That was a big thing. And also I noticed in our neighborhood there were only a few people that were overweight. This is kind of what happened. In the late 1970s, many of the women that their kids were like going into junior high, they were wanting to go back to work. They were maybe wanting to go back to secretarial work, things like that. Now, my dad really didn't prefer for my mom to go back to work. She would have gone back to being a hairdresser. That's what she did before she married my dad, and even right after she married him. But he thought, why? We don't have to. My dad was a truck driver. We can live off this income. Let's continue to do that, because my mom's primary job, even though my dad did help out, was taking care of the yard, the house, cooking, all of that. My dad took care of basically making the money and paying the bills. They had a system, it worked for them, and they were a good team with that. I noticed then in the 1980s, now I'm not saying that all this is necessarily negative, but I felt different in my world. It seemed like our home was the place where all the women would come over and have coffee in the afternoon. It was kind of nice. They'd get together and chat about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and they'd sit there for a while and just visit. Then the late 1970s, many of these women that would come over and visit started to go back to work. And we noticed this with them. What I started noticing more at the same time was that the families that the women went back to work, you notice this in the grocery store, more frozen meals. People were eating from cans. There were not the homemade meals. I noticed that more people were going to fast food places to get things to eat, going out for lunch during lunch. I noticed these women met new friends at work because they didn't have anything in common with my mom anymore. So we didn't have all these visits coming over. Not only that, people wanted more. They thought their little small 3-bedroom, 1-bath Rambler was too small. They were wanting bigger homes. Most everybody stayed in Woodbury, the suburb, but people were moving out and buying bigger homes. And during this time, the interest rates were really going up. If I'm not mistaken, when we bought our home in Stillwater, I think the interest rate on that house was 13%. And I remember the house payment being quite large. I also noticed, too, that people were shopping more. People were always out shopping, buying jewelry and clothing. Back when I grew up, you only bought, clothing maybe during different seasons. You were not always out shopping unless you needed things. And there were more hand-me-downs and things like that, using more used things. The people then in the 80s, I noticed they were moving to bigger homes. And like I said, more shopping, more restaurant eating, 2-car families. That I noticed towards the late 70s, early 80s, people were not wanting just regular TV anymore. They were either wanting satellite or cable TV. Then there was Blockbuster, so they were renting movies, so there was more entertainment, and they were spending money on all of that. Also, and I never enjoyed it, but the video games came out, and people were really wanting to play video games a lot too, and so people were spending money on that. And so these are some of the things I noticed. Also in the 80s, some of the family and friends started getting car phones and having them in the car, plus home phones. And so these are just some of the things. And people seem to be too busy to help each other anymore. Also, because of all the restaurant eating or fast food eating and frozen dinners, and people just being rushed all the time and not having a lot of time anymore to be at home, people started gaining weight because they weren't just eating their simple homemade meals. They were eating at restaurants and probably eating larger meals. Many of these places they would go with supersized things. You were drinking more soda. When I grew up, soda pop or a Coke or a Pepsi, it was more for a special occasion. So these are some of the things that I noticed, and I think because of that, people were spending a lot more money in the 1980s, and I personally enjoyed the 1970s much more. This is from my perspective. I know it's wonderful to have a career, and I'm not saying anything wrong with women out there working and contributing to the family. That can all be fabulous, but I've told you guys this several times. Many times, not in all cases, but many times, the more a family makes income-wise, the more you spend and the more you have the lifestyle creep and the less time you have. So, would you rather live a simpler life and make less money? Would you rather make more money and maybe have a busier life? Actually, I'd like a third option. Make more money but have a simpler life. That to me would be the best option of all, and I do think that's very possible. Let me know if any of you are about my age. I'm 55, born March of 65. How did you see comparing the 70s to the 80s? Do you feel the same way, or did you have a totally different experience? I'd like to hear from you in the comments below. And by the way, don't you think this shirt from the 1980s or sweater is in really good condition since it's, I don't even know what year, I think it's from 1985 to 86, but I think it's in really good shape considering. Let me know what you guys think. I always love to hear from you. By the way, before signing off, tomorrow starts my series that will be coming on Mondays all about the Tightwad Gazette. Is that information relevant to now? And we're going to be talking about that and discussing more about that book and different topics in the book. That's all for now. This is Money Mom signing off, and as always, I love you. Bye-bye.